And next speaker is Laurel Zwissler, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. And she's a professor of religion at Central Michigan University, USA. Her research monograph is Religious Feminist Activist, Cosmologies of Interconnection, and she co-edits the University of Pennsylvania journal Magic, Ritual and Witchcraft. Her presentation tonight is called Gold is the New Black, Race, the Academic Study of Religion and the Golden Bough. Thanks, Laurel.
Thank you so much for putting this all together, Caroline and Stephanie. And thanks to my fellow presenters. This weekend has been such a delight. So I'm just glad to be able to contribute. All right, I do have a few slides for everybody, just to give you something to have a look at while I talk. Here we go. I'm assuming you can see this. All right, let's do this. All right, so this paper investigates Frazer's influence within both the academic study of religion and new religious movements, such as contemporary paganism and New Age traditions, with focus on his deployment of religion to code cultural difference and race. As many of our presenters over the weekend, and indeed this conference itself, have demonstrated, the Golden Bough has been received not only as empirical scholarship, but also sometimes as a key to decode universal religious experience, and not infrequently as a repository of tools for spiritual expression. I come to this project from the perspective of the academic study of religion. Like many disciplines represented here, the study of religion is in a crucial self-reflective turn, and scholars are engaged in considering the myriad ways that our field has been both a product of and a tool for furthering colonialism and white supremacy. Perhaps more starkly than other disciplines, facing our complicities in the academic study of religion means also wrestling with the constructed nature of our very subject, that is, the concept of religion itself. Because he explicitly centers religious modalities in his scheme of cultural evolution, and because other founding theorists, such as Durkheim, Weber, and Freud, engage the Golden Bough, Frazer's work becomes a crucial consideration in this newest round of reckoning. Frazer and many of his audiences over the last century understood his project as descriptive and analytical. He was just giving us the facts stripped of moral claims. When he is more self-aware that he is weighing in on what he describes, it is usually to editorialize the fertility sacrifice of a king as tragic, occasionally as murder. In some ways, the Golden Bough actually kind of reads like a listicle. Frazer gives us a category, say, incarnate human gods, or killing the divine animal, and then spends pages, sometimes volumes, listing examples, both cross-cultural and transhistorically, that he has found to fit his category. In a postmodern world, it is easy for us to judge how little awareness Frazer seems to have of how much larger hegemonic paradigms shape his work. Constructs of race and nation, which are ultimately the problem of Britain itself, are extrapolated to the West more broadly. As articulated by medievalist Geraldine Heng, the challenge is harmonizing ethnic group identification with the reality of cultural heterogeneity. While often positioned as a problem of contemporary immigration, in Britain's status not only as an incorporator of immigrants, but as a coalescing nation whose immigration has historically resulted from conquest, cultural diversity has always been part of its story. Part of the way that British elites, and European elites more broadly, responded to the challenge was through strong identification with their own invaders, more specifically, ancient Romans. In other words, they structurally identified with their colonizers as forefathers. And now, knowing from Ronald's talk that Frazer actively rejected his actual father's worldview, this adds like a sprinkle of psychoanalytic intrigue to his projections of savage tyranny into the classical world. The internalizing of conqueror's identity helps explain the power of the twinned projects of classicism and colonialism that reached their height in the Victorian era and that we can see throughout the Golden Bough. Both national pursuits are mutually supportive ways of working through the confusion of being a nation of multiple ethnicities and the cultural trauma of being conquered through multiple incursions. Intense identification with classical Rome not only sanctifies colonialism, but also calls for delineating internal hierarchies as well. That is, while some Britons are the inheritors of classical civilization and elevated culture, other Britons represent Taylorian survivals of primitive indigeneity, akin to those found within colonized people. In this way, Victorian elites displace a sense of ethnic purity onto class, positioning themselves as the true inheritors of their classical colonizers, and thereby distinguishing themselves from others, not only abroad, but even within geographical proximity. Speaking of belief in magic, for example, Frazer writes, quote, "Among the ignorant and superstitious classes of modern Europe, it is very much as it was thousands of years ago in Egypt and India, and what it is now among the lowest savages surviving in the remotest corners of the world," end quote. While this transposition of racial hierarchy onto class may obfuscate its underpinnings, it not only does not replace race, but allows its continuation under guise. As theorist Mallory Nye has argued, disdain for superstition, or so-called primitive religion, does not challenge discourses of racial prejudice, but instead redeploys them in a less blatant and therefore more socially palatable container. For Frazer, if the value of humanity is equally distributed among all peoples, it is not evenly distributed among individuals. We see evidence of this not only in Frazer's general elitism, but in his deeply conservative admiration for tyrants, itself consistent with Tyler's cultural step from savagery to barbarity. Justifying his universalization in the face of global religious diversity, Frazer writes, quote, "When we have penetrated through these differences, which affect mainly the intelligent and thoughtful part of the community, we shall find underlying them a solid stratum of intellectual agreement among the dull, the weak, the ignorant, and the superstitious, who constitute, unfortunately, the vast majority of mankind," end quote. Even though he tells us that his schema is universal, a great many of his more contemporary examples come from Africa and rural Europe, leading him to speculate on direct, though prehistoric, cultural transmission. In the same way that national movements often create analogies to women in order to discipline male participants into defensive performances of masculinity, so too Frazer attributes magical thinking to peasants and people of color abroad in order to rhetorically discipline his white middle-class readers into accepting his perspectives on religion, which are really his perspectives on Christianity. Nonetheless, it's important to acknowledge the conversations into which Frazer, following Tyler, was entering. In his universalism, he was explicitly arguing against ideas that not all people are fully human, that not all races have the capacity for rational thought, and that Christianity, and therefore Christians, are morally superior to other religions. It is in this context, and let's be honest, really only in this context, that Frazer can come to look progressive. I do, however, want to be really clear. This is not an apology for Frazer's obvious racism, but instead a deconstruction with the goal of flagging its continuing influences. Throughout the Golden Bough, Frazer engages in a process of countering essentialist race claims. Adopting Tyler's concept of psychic unity, Frazer proceeds from an assumption that all races of people share origins. Special individuals within each group, of all races, were capable not only of rational thought, but of remarkable intelligence, which propelled them to leadership. And Christianity, rather than being special, was just one more example of universal human religion of the fertility cult, just as gruesome as it had always been. In keeping with cultural schemes inherited from Tyler, he placed all human communities on a shared trajectory of development, albeit at different levels along that path. It is clear from contemporary perspective that his positioning of cultures is both ethnocentric and justifies colonialism. It certainly leaves open the possibility that cultures could be sped along the incline towards rationality and civilization by the intervention of others more developed. Moreover, in positioning Christianity as just one more fertility cult among all the others, Frazer leaves open the possibility for new interpretations of its morality over and against other religions. It is clear that to secularly inclined Frazer, this comparison was meant to unsettle Christianity as a sign of civilization, implying that it was just one more plateau on the human journey to rationality and science. However, while he expected the Bough's compendium of sacrificial and sexual practices to be horrifying to his readers, we know that this was not always the case. In creating sameness, Frazer also creates alterity. He understands the choice he offers as a dichotomy between ignorant superstition and rational science, but some of his readers have taken it instead as a triptych and chosen a third option. If modern Christianity is the problem, then there may be more than one solution. One is the rationalized secularity Frazer sets us up to accept, but another could be a more self-conscious enchantment. Instead of throwing out religion with all the other barbaric dross, some audiences instead use Frazer's troubling of Christianity as moral mandate to explore other religions that Christianity denounced. As Helen and Vanessa and Carolyn, as all of us today have laid out, a major movement that has done this rehabilitating is contemporary paganism. And we're going to visit some old friends. Egyptologist Margaret Murray changed the trajectory of scholarship on the history of European witch persecutions by grafting Frazer's fertility cult theory onto archival trial records. And I love this picture of her, even though she's desecrating a mummy. It really highlights the sort of Indiana Jones nature that she brought to her life and research. Locked out of her field by World War I, she turned her attention to a research project she could pursue in England. The Witch Cult in Western Europe was the first of 3 books expounding her theory. Now widely debunked among academics, starting with Norman Cohn's critique in the 70s, Murray's theory of a surviving witch cult as the original religion of Britain and the authentic foundation of its folkways has lived on in the inspiration for Wicca, itself a significant foundation of contemporary paganism and witchcrafts more broadly. Gerald Gardner took Murray's theory and so the golden bough underlying it literally and publicized his developing religion as the very witch cult Murray traced through European history, and therefore also as a survival of the Frazerian fertility cult. Murray and Gardner had a kind of symbiosis, each validating the claims of the other. Gardner publicly positioned his Wicca as surviving proof of Murray's theories, and Murray was kind enough to write a foreword to Gardner's Witchcraft Today in 1954. While never explicitly validating Gardner's claims, attaching her name to the book implied legitimacy and furthered their shared goal of displacing Christianity as the true heritage religion of Britain. While Wicca is the most widely recognized of Murray's religious offspring, other pagan and witchcraft traditions touch back to her work. In feminist witchcraft movements, especially those coming out of the American counterculture of the 60s and 70s, witches such as Z. Budapest and Starhawk, and goddess theologians such as Mary Daly, include Murray as an important source for the narrative that accused witches really were up to something alternative in the early modern period. Their ultimately suppressed religion was matriarchal, joyful, and of the people. Taking inspiration from feminist witchcraft, activists for the gay liberation movement, such as Arthur Evans, author of Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture, and Harry Hay, co-founder of the Radical Fairies, included Murray's work in their genealogies of what they call gay shamanism. Ultimately, Murray's interpretations of Frazer's theories about the original religion of humankind, one that a jealous Christianity attempted to eradicate, were adopted among groups that were disenfranchised by Christian morality and used as mandate for redeveloping previously rejected religious practices. Frazer's distaste for the surviving barbarity he found within Christianity was reinterpreted via Murray as endorsing pre-Christian traditions as a spiritual resource, especially for activists focused on gender and sexuality. In this way, the Golden Bough could be seen as evidence for and even mandate for anti-racism and other social justice causes, such as when Evans calls for gay men to ally with others across oppressed identities, including, quote, third world people, women, the poor, the imprisoned, and the insane, end quote. Nonetheless, the approach never transcends the problem of the primitive all parties inherit from Romanticism. So using Frazer against his grain as moral permission and resource means that contemporary alternative religions have inadvertently built on his supremacist scaffolding. The Golden Bough, therefore, has been a major mechanism of perpetuating Protestant reductionism and racism within the realm of alternative religious practice. As one example, taking Frazer as a model means assuming that religious practices from different cultural groups have been developed to accomplish the same goals and are therefore simply variations on universal spiritual tools as recognized and defined by white Westerners based on their personal experiences. If each magical and religious practice is simply an idiosyncratic version of every other, if there is a universal human religion, then there really is no such thing as cultural appropriation. It's impossible to take something out of context because the truly enlightened understand that there is only one context, the human spiritual experience shared across time, space, and ethnicity. It's this thinking that underlies problems such as those Linda Donaldson has denounced as New Age Native Americanism and Valdosta calls out as playing Indian, for example. Feminist theologian Rosemary Radford Ruether argues that this absorbing religious mindset is not only colonial, but is even more specifically very Roman. Everyone else's gods are really versions of your gods, and their practices are really your practices. And this is a very Hellenized Isis there for you. In this way, universality is defined by and belongs to the beholder. The universalizing impulse of contemporary paganism, as inspired by Frazer, may have inherited more from classical paganism than it really means to. This genealogy also raises important questions about Wicca being offered to white practitioners as an alternative to appropriating the religious traditions of other cultures, especially those of BIPOC folks. So Peg asked on Friday why more people don't care about Frazer's racism or why we don't talk about it more. And I don't think that there's a single answer to this. I certainly encourage us to talk more about this in Q&A. But I do think that we can identify some of the factors that have contributed to leaving his egregious racism unremarked upon, is maybe a way of putting it. First, I think that many conveniently misunderstand his project. His point in comparing rural peasants, people of color, and bourgeois Christians is not to elevate the former, but to shame the latter. And this is made easier by kind of laundering him through Murray and then Gardner. Cynthia Eller the other day was talking about sort of this recycling, and I realized actually maybe a better term for this is upcycling, right? You take something and turn it into something new. So Murray talks a lot about witchcraft as class warfare, even though she herself is as ambivalent as Frazer is about who exactly is good there. But by the time we hit the counterculture, there's just this assumption that if we're talking about a class conflict, then obviously we're siding with the underclass. But secondly, and this is more uncomfortable and I think therefore probably closer to the heart of the matter, white people will go to great lengths not to explicitly name racism because doing so demands action. And at the very least in Frazer's case, this would mean a revisitation of disciplinary foundations for several academic fields and new religious movements. It's more convenient to build on top of rotten foundations than to dig them out. And it looks like this is what most people have been doing with the Golden Bough, picking through Frazer's already picked over anecdotes and leaving his darker themes unturned. A common justification for this enabling behavior is to dismiss racism as historically appropriate, as of his time, as if we can just dust it off and take what we still want from his work. This is behind sheepish defenses like, and I thought about whether naming it, but I'm just going to, the one that Dr. Parkin offered us in his welcome remarks the other day, right? The general theme being that Frazer is offensive and wrong, but he meant well, right? Here it is crucial to remember that Frazer was contemporary with what is literally called the progressive era. His day included activism for full legal rights for women and people of color across Western countries, and that very much included Britain during his time. Even though his racism was of a different sort than that of the essentialists to whom he was responding, he was still staunchly conservative within his own context, and he tells us a reductionist story. Finally, the Golden Bough has been, and continues to be of most interest to Western white folks, even if some of those interested readers identify as progressive. And here, I think it's also important to remember that not all of his readers do identify as progressive. His story has been put to many uses, including racist Heart of Darkness narratives and satanic panic sort of themes that turn into the folk horror genre. White people are the protagonists of this fairy tale. Everyone else is a supporting character in the service of their hero's journey. And there has never been much incentive for us to consider what it costs to maintain that constructed path. Jewish studies scholar Dana Horn argues that political appeals for religious tolerance based on the idea that we're really all the same are empirically doomed to fail because they perpetuate the idea that difference is actually bad. Yet these kinds of arguments remain overwhelmingly popular. I suggest that the Golden Bough and its various receptions can help us understand both the appeal and the inherent flaws of such arguments, especially because Frazer did not think that the universal story he was describing for us was a good thing. He wanted it to fade away under the cleansing light of scientific rationality. The Golden Bough is a quintessential example of the colonial inflected process of aligning multiple diversities into singular difference, specifically through ideas of comparative religion. For Frazer, there was continuity between the religious practices of ancient peoples, colonized societies abroad, and contemporary rural Europe. His universality contextualized Christianity as just one more religion among many, seemingly gesturing beyond xenophobia towards a comparative religion worldview in which past and foreign religions are also valuable expressions of human potential. This is the version of Frazer most readily embraced by academic method and theory, as well as practitioners in new religious movements looking to transcend particular established institutions in favor of a universal spirituality able to be legitimately expressed in multiple forms. However, Frazer's approach simultaneously devalues all religions as developmentally behind a Protestant-inflected secularity, a scientific outlook, and suggests that rural peasants are as backward as forward, quote-unquote, savages. Thus, there is a racialization of rural people in Frazer's thought that easily feeds prejudice against both people of color abroad and working class people within the homeland. Further, though beyond the scope of my talk today, in keeping with long traditions of anti-Catholicism, it also racializes the very concept of religion itself. To be clear, Frazer's project was not exclusively a racial project, but one that simultaneously draws on interconnecting hierarchies of class, geography, culture, and religion to create mutually reinforcing signifiers of inferiority. Difference in one category is understood as both cause and symptom of difference in others. Thus, religious difference in and of itself can serve as both sign and cipher for racial difference, while also obfuscating racial anxieties under the cover of theological disagreement or cultural critique. As the academic study of religion continues to reckon with its entanglements with colonial white supremacy, and as new religious movements struggle with traditions of cultural appropriation, Frazer offers a stark example of a self-identified scientific and descriptive project that is clearly not. The point is not that Frazer is an aberration or a failure, but that he has done us the favor of throwing into relief racial dynamics across discourses about religion more broadly. Thank you.